is up, guys? It is time for a little MLB early live before lock, where we have ourselves a 4-game slate to hit on. We're going to take you through everything you need to know for these 4 games and go game by game to dig into it all. I am Chris Spags, joined once again by my normal co-pilot here on these early morning live before locks, as well as the MLB strategy show. He's nerd-ass Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Yeah, so you wouldn't have been aware of this, but people were upset with you yesterday during the show because they thought that you duck Tuesday shows on purpose because there tend to be bigger slates. So people think this is some sort of clever maneuver by you to get out of the Tuesday strategy shows because it's always like 13, 14 game slates. But no, we don't pick. We just do the shows that were put on. So Spags isn't trying to duck it. He's not trying to maneuver himself into getting to talk about 4-game slates. Which the other thing also, which people I think don't always realize about doing content in the shows, it's actually kind of easier to do 13-game slates than 4 3-game slates because 4 3-game slates there's just not as much to talk about. The 13-game slate, it's maybe not ideal in terms of fitting everything into an hour, except there's a whole lot more to talk about.
Yeah, that's an odd thing to think. Like, I don't know what people think out there, but for me, I did this deeper dive yesterday. I did a deeper dive Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So it's not like I don't have to prep the slate. Like I still have to do all my homework, as you guys all out there have to do for yourselves too. But no, I embrace any slate. And if there's any slate that wants to challenge me one-on-one, boy, I will take them right into the virtual boxing ring and punch any 13-game slate right in the chops if I need to. But hey, you know what? That's what we're here for, guys, to talk about baseball. We're going to do that for you guys today. And some things to note on the site today. Free premium tool of the day is going to be the main slate ownership projection. So we'll talk to you guys about some of the early slate ownership, obviously, as we go through each game. We'll also do some money time at the halfway point of the show and give you guys the top 5 owned plays on Draftkings and Fanduel according to our ownership projections at Awesemo.com. But today, if you want to play the main slate as well, you can check out all the ownership for free by yourselves. And if you don't want to pay for it, that's fine for today. Tomorrow, you'll have to, but today, go check that out on the site today. And also, we have to say my first time reading this read for our new sponsor, PrizePicks, who's offering the simplest fantasy game on the market. And I have to say, from looking around the site earlier before the show, I think it really does bear out pretty well. You could say goodbye to sharks, lineup optimizers, and mass multi-entry. Simply pick 2, 3, 4, or 5 players available on the board to go over or under on their projected score. And if you correctly select a 5-player lineup, you can net up to 10x your entry fee from the NFL and NBA to esports, as well as MLB. PrizePicks has it. You combine your picks across all sports available. Download the mobile app in the App Store or on Google Play today. Make your first deposit to receive an instant deposit match of up to $100 when you use the promo code Awesemo. You can simplify your daily fantasy life with PrizePicks today, so go check that out. And some of the easy, I guess easy is going to be relative here, but some of the more appealing ones I would say on there, a Minnesota team that I think is going to be very loftily on the normal DFS sites. Maybe you take the over 1.5 hits and walks for guys like Nelson Cruz, like a Josh Donaldson on PrizePicks today, and you don't have to play all these guys. You can just play 2 of these guys, try to correlate them if you want, but that's sort of the advantage of PrizePicks is that you can either change what you're doing with your DFS plays, you can get hedge against what you're doing on there, or just get exposure to guys that you're fading so you can maybe mitigate some of the disasters if the chalk does go off today. So go check out PrizePicks, and again, use that promo code Awesemo for yourself. $100 deposit match is a pretty big one. We have some good deals from our other sponsors, but this is, I think, the best one we've seen. So $100 deposit match, go play on PrizePicks today. And Greg, have you dabbled in there at all? I know you're learning about it as I am at the same time, but PrizePicks, hey, we are getting deeper and deeper into the fantasy world.
Yeah, still learning it for sure. One thing I'm kind of curious about, though, is it seems to me like an optimal strategy would be to stack an individual offense, right? So if you are just like you would with MLB DFS, like we're going to talk about the Twins later, and I saw Larry C brought it up in the chat. They're projected for a ridiculous amount of ownership today. They're also projected to be one of the best offenses of the day, but for just DraftKings purposes, I would say I want to be lighter on the Twins in the field due to the amount of ownership they're picking up. But obviously something like that wouldn't matter for PrizePicks. So I would think maybe doing something like, hey, I'm going to parlay together the overs for Josh Donaldson and Nelson Cruz, for example, or whoever ends up being in the lineup for them today. Like, to me, that's something that would be pretty appealing to core. Oh, we just got the Twins lineup, by the way, to correlate your players and create some upside.
Yeah, so Nelson Cruz in the lineup finally, I guess, with Minnesota pulling him a lot lately. And I'm actually not even doing this to razz our producer, Tyler, who is so deeply upset when we talk about Nelson Cruz. But he is a play that I'll be playing in the lineup today in this confirmed lineup. And I think on PrizePicks, a solid one. And I think your point's pretty solid. And I would say to people out there, too, who sometimes, either you like the information we're giving out or just feel a different way. Like, it doesn't have to be adversarial either. Play on PrizePicks because you're not competing against people on there. You're not even worrying about that. If you just have your feel about a pick, if you like a guy, you just play him on on there and not even worry about the constructs of ownership and tournaments and all that. I think that's a big appeal for people out there who do understand daily fantasy sports, but maybe you're running bad with the actual lineup construction and that process and all of that. But let's get into the slate, Greg, and hit that like button, guys. We appreciate it a bunch. And tune into the MLB Deeper Dive coming up in 3 hours. So I guess a little bit less than that now, where I'll be back with Alex and Max talking about the main slate too. So if you're looking for that content, check it out then. But any overarching thoughts for you, or do you just want to get into the game by game?
We could get into the game by game. One thing just about this slate that I think could make it a little interesting is, so by the way, we're going to have to mostly be talking about Draftkings just because Draftkings is running a 4-game slate. Fanduel is running a 2-game slate. So obviously a lot more games on Draftkings, and there's more app strategy. Maybe we have more options, but I do wonder how the ownership is going to be impacted by the fact that we have 2 games starting later in the day. So in terms of Eastern Standard Time, we have a 4 o'clock game, a 3:30 game, and then we have 2 earlier games at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock. The reason that's significant is heading into lock, I assume we're not going to have the lineups for any of the 4 later starting teams. And I have a feeling that could impact ownership a little bit.
That's a good point. Definitely a little more of the strategy there that's going to go into things. So we also got a projections update here that I'm going to paste in so I have the best information possible for this little journey of ours today. But let's start off with Baltimore getting 3.5 implied runs against Michael Pineda. Pineda had been getting jerked around the starting rotation recently, but on the year has been pretty good. A 1.01 whip, 25% K rate. Really historically has been a pretty good pitcher in terms of not giving up walks and hits with a 1.14 whip. The home run rate for him, maybe not the best to see. A 5% home run rate going into a matchup against Baltimore. I guess maybe some power here in this lineup that could get to him. But Pineda, I think a reasonable play. The issue with him really is this 35% ownership projection we have on him at Awesemo.com today. And I have no issue with Pineda normally. I do think this lineup offers a good amount of strikeouts on the year, 24% K rate, which is basically league average this year. But the low implied total would make me like Pineda, but this ownership, like, I think you can get to the 35%. And I feel like this is what we say a lot with MLB, but I find it really hard to want to get above Pineda. And I think just with him being that chalky, Greg, I just feel like maybe you can come in a little bit lower and find some other ways to go.
Yeah, and there's also another thing that adds a little bit of variance here is he's just getting activated off the injured list today. And he was dealing with something a little wonky, at least something we don't normally see. He had it was an abscess on his thigh that he had to have some sort of like minor surgery on to have it removed. So who knows what that's going to mean in terms of his pitch count or how effective he's going to be. You know, maybe that'll impact his velocity and maybe his ability to push off or something like that. I mean, as is this season, we've seen Pineda's velocity is way down compared to some previous years that we've seen in the past, which I mean, there's a lot of reasons to think that could be the case. He's had a number of arm injuries. He had an elbow injury, he had a shoulder injury. He's also been suspended for PEDs. So I'm sure that that hasn't helped his velocity this year and over the last couple of years. But I've thought with Pineda for a while now this year that we're eventually going to start to look at some sort of decline for him. Number one, his underlying stats are not nearly as good as his ERA. He has a 2.79 ERA, but a 4.41 expected ERA, a 4.59 FIP, and then just that velocity numbers we've seen over the last few years, the PED suspension, all the injuries I talked about. Well, 2016, average fastball velocity 94.7, then the year after 93.9, then 92.6, 92.1, and this year down to 91.3. So we've seen a pretty steady decrease in his velocity. Then you also can combine that with he's been getting really lucky this year. And also now his first start coming off the injured list. We saw something like that with DeGrom yesterday where it was kind of unknown how deep he was going to work in the game. They pulled him after 63 pitches. So when you see somebody as popular as Pineda is with all these question marks that are surrounding him, I'd rather be on the other side of it.
I think that makes sense. And again, it's a large ownership number for Pineda. And I think to me, normally that's something that for a guy like Pineda, who is fine, but not a world beater by any stretch, I wouldn't mind getting different there. But I agree. Like, I think with some of the risk, I guess the question for you, Greg, would be, would you want to take him out entirely? Would you shave him down? Because to me, I think capping him at like 20% feels like the best strategic move.
I have very, very limited amount of him in my build. It's not none, except it's just some lineups here and there. I'm significantly underweight to the field on him. I have a higher percentage of Orioles stacks than I do of lineups that have Pineda in them.
I guess let's talk about that side then. I think you can make that case to go that way, especially if you are not a believer in Pineda or if you're just, fading him because of practical reasons. Maybe you do get some more of the Baltimore hitters, and it is a mediocre bullpen behind Pineda. They have a 1.4 whip on the year, giving up just shy of a 4% on run rate. I do think that to me gives me some hope that if you are going against Pineda and he does pitch a little bit shorter, you are going to get a bullpen that's not been the best. Baltimore hitters, though, also not fantastic, only a 139 ISO on the year against right-hand pitching. Which Baltimore hitters are really jumping out strikeouts. You can pay 5,300 for Trey Mancini and get 1% ownership, and the rest of it, I feel like, nothing noteworthy in terms of ownership. So it does seem, Greg, like you will be a man mostly to yourself to these Baltimore hitters right now.
Hey, that's the way I like it. And so looking at my lineups now, I just had to rerun my crunch for the Orioles because the lineup came out literally as we were starting the show. But I do have my Orioles stacks built, and it looks like the players who I'm getting the most exposure to right now, Cedric Mullins, Freddie Galvis, Anthony Santander. Those are the core ones. Mancini, while he's definitely in the player pool and guy that I'm getting some exposure to, it's hard to really totally prioritize him in stacks just because he's so expensive. But the rest of these guys are so cheap that you could really make 5-man Orioles stacks, pay up for Rodon at pitcher, and then stack whatever other bats you want around them because of all the salary savings they offer. So to me, the other thing also here, we have the really high ownership of Pineda. There's some question marks around him. I don't have the utmost amount of confidence in the Orioles themselves, but they have a very positive leverage score in our top stack tool, which is something I rely on pretty heavily. And then just all that ownership going to Pineda, it seems like a really good leverage spot to me.
Yeah, no, I think that makes some sense. And even if you're not the biggest believer in Baltimore, I think from a tournament standpoint, Greg makes some sense. There are going to be a couple other pitchers that you can target as well who are going to be pretty chalky, but Pineda with the injuries, with some of his power issues, I think there is some logic there, even if they don't appear to be the most priority stack in terms of how people approach things. And they do, for whatever it's worth as well, seem to be under-owned on the top stack. So 8.6% chance of being a top stack with 5.5% aggregate ownership, and also a 15% chance of being the top value stack on the day. So if you're paying up for Rodon and maybe some higher price bats, that's one way to get there, is to go to Baltimore. On the other side, we have Jorge Lopez pitching. Lopez has been not the best this year, giving up a 270 batting average, though actually that is an improvement on where he was since 2019 with a 281 batting average. Also getting strikeouts at a 24% clip. And Jorge Lopez, not a guy that I would normally want to target as a pitcher, but on a shorter slate, Greg, I feel like you can sort of make the case to get there to some degree, whatever that degree may be. If it's just the field's 2.5% projected ownership, I think that's more than enough as well. But what do you feel about Jorge Lopez? Because he's normally a guy that I would target against, but he does get strikeouts, and I think there is some leverage to be had, or, normally the pitcher leverage, not necessarily the best going against a stack, but he gets a few strikeouts here. He can break up a chalky Minnesota day and maybe be useful himself.
So here's the positives. He does have a career high 23.9% strikeout rate. His velocity is up a little bit this year. He has a 95.3 average fastball velocity. But overall, I mean, you look at the numbers this year, is a 6 ERA. Even though he's been a little bit unlucky to have that number, I mean, 4.78 expected ERA, 5.19 FIP. We're talking about a guy who gives up a ton of hard contact and has never really been all that successful at the big league level. He's an ERA north of 6 in each of the last 2 full seasons for his career. He has a 6.03 ERA, and he's always underperformed his peripheral stats. So Jorge Lopez, actually, I mean, the more you look at his numbers, it's kind of curious that he's still been in the big league since 2015. I mean, he's 28 years old and he's consistently been bad. His best ERA ever for his career is 5.03 for a full season. That was in 2018 with the Brewers and the Royals. So there's a reason he's bounced around for a few teams, and it's not because he's been so successful that teams are dying to roster him. It's just he kind of burns out places. He makes teams, I guess, at the end of the roster towards the end of spring training. But this feels like it should be the end of the run for Jorge Lopez, and I can't roster somebody who's literally never had any success in the major leagues.
So I guess, yeah, that's reasonable. And one thing that maybe is more of an inhibitor to the Minnesota bats is the fact that Lopez does keep the ball down pretty well. And this is something that we had a super chat yesterday on the deeper dive asking about Tampa Bay's bats, and somebody was really into them. And actually a couple people in the chat were very much hyping them up as a team to go to. And Brad Keller is a guy who's not very good, but his one ability is keeping that ball down. And that is something that, Keller himself had a really good day. I'm not saying Jorge Lopez has that day necessarily, but I do think, to me, seeing the launch angle, a 5.5 degree launch angle on average from Jorge Lopez, there are some pathways for him to sort of suppress Minnesota power. So I'd be willing to take some stabs on him at pitcher. But I think really the net result for me is that I think you have to come in under a little bit on this Minnesota stack. They're projected to be overall in the top stacks tool, 15% chance of being a top stack with 23.4% aggregate ownership. And I like Minnesota a lot. I think the weather in Minnesota being a little bit colder today is going to be a bit of a help, 55 degrees by the time the first pitch goes off. But I just feel like Minnesota had this much ownership, like even going against Lopez, me pointing to something with Lopez, with him keeping the ball down, also a 27% fly ball rate for him. I think I'm willing to justify it just to sort of give my reason why I'm not willing to go as heavy on Minnesota, Greg. But how are you feeling about the field? I know with how you play MLB DFS, I have to assume you're going to be greatly under on Minnesota today.
Yeah, so I mean, I just talked about how bad Jorge Lopez is, and that would stand reason to think I like the Twins. And in a vacuum, sure, I would. I think this is a team with a tremendous amount of upside, but the field is so overweight to them that right now in my build, the way I have my stack set up, the Twins are the team that I have the least amount of exposure to as a stack. It's not 0% because it's only a 4-game slate, but every other team of the day, with the exception actually of the Cardinals going up against Carlos Rodon, I have more exposure to today. It's just an issue with ownership where we have them with a 15% chance to be the top stack of the day, but a 23% ownership share. So I'll take my chances with pretty much any other team on the slate, the White Sox, the A's, the Orioles, and just hope that anybody who isn't the Twins ends up being the highest scoring team. And just given what the ownership is, as long as some other team goes off, I feel like I'm in a pretty good spot.
If you were to play Minnesota, and you've given your stance about how you're going to play it, and I think we're on the same page with that as well. But is there anything you would do with Minnesota to try to get the ownership down if you wanted to play them? Like, I go to the bottom of the order. That's always one little life hack, I guess, to try to get the ownership product on a stack down. If you have somebody who's good from that 6 to 9 hole, but you have Trevor Larnach, you have Astudillo, you have Ref Snyder, you have Andrelton Simmons, and none of these guys have enough power to really justify getting there. But Greg, for you, is there anything that you would do, I guess, with Minnesota, whether it be, shorter stacks or including one of those guys? Does any of those options appeal to you to just get a slightly different construction for the Twins?
I'm just going to bring up the ownership really quick because I don't have the ownership for the most recent lineup yet. Do you know if we have that?
No, it hasn't been updated yet. It was an hour ago.
Okay. Yeah, so that makes it a little hard to know just because the lineup is a little bit different than what was expected, right? Because, I mean, we had Josh Donaldson was projected to be major chalk on the slate. He isn't in the lineup. Arise, he was expected to be like nearly 40% owned. He isn't in the lineup. So that's something that makes this a little bit tricky, is just because the guys who are supposed to be chalk plays on the Twins aren't in the lineup. And maybe we get an updated ownership and that actually ends up being the case that the Twins aren't all that popular, right? Because if these two guys who are picking up so much ownership aren't in the lineup, if the field doesn't get to some of the other guys at a higher rate, then maybe the Twin stack comes down in overall ownership. Mitch Garver also not in the lineup, and maybe that will then make the Twins more of an appealing stack to me. But for right now, the guys that I not really prioritizing anybody, but at least if I had to pick out individual players with upside that don't have crazy ownership, if you want to pay up for Nelson Cruz, like I said, if you're making an Orioles stack, there's a lot of space to pay up for really whoever else you want because the Orioles are so cheap. Nelson Cruz only projected for 17% ownership. That would be reasonable. Miguel Sano, he has a lot of power and home run upside. He's only projected for 15% ownership. And then Jorge Polanco is only projected for 13% ownership. So those are guys who are maybe a little bit overpriced, except they're also not the Twins guys that are picking up massive amounts of ownership.
Yeah, no, I think that makes some sense. And I think, to me, I'm just trying to figure out like how this construction would go. It's also a weird lineup too, because you have 3 guys who could be played at first base, many guys who could be played at outfielder, nobody who could be played at second base. Actually, no, you have Polanco still, but no third baseman who you could play now because no Donaldson. It's a weird construction. I think the one construction that does jump out where just people won't get there is if you did include Kirilloff, Sano, and Astudillo, because those guys are all first basemen, and they Kirilloff and Astudillo have other positions they could go to. But like, that to me is the one way you can get there. But as Greg talked about, the ownership's going to move around so much that I imagine Astudillo could end up very chalky because he's the only guy in Minnesota lineup that's at that same price tag, or relatively the same price tag as Luis Arias was going to be.
Yeah, Astudillo hasn't been good lately, but overall for his career, he's a decent enough hitter. And then you also factor in the price at 3,100, the catcher eligibility. I would be pretty surprised if he's actually not the chalk catcher this slate.
Yeah, and he doesn't strike out. It's one thing he has going for him. Does not have a ton of pop overall since 2019, given up or has him just a 150 ISO for himself against right-hand pitching, but only a 5% strikeout rate, which is actually incredibly impressive for a hitter who doesn't really do a lot. But still, Astudillo definitely going to get some ownership rise here. So we'll see if that ownership updates hopefully in the next 10 minutes or so, but we'll keep an eye on it for you guys and update you accordingly. Let's talk about the next game. We got St. Louis getting 3.4 implied runs against Carlos Rodon. Rodon on the year, 37% K rate, has been really good with a 0.8 whip as well. 2.7 xFIP. All these numbers are going to be the best on the slate by a pretty good margin. A 1.2% on run rate too, so not giving up much in the way of power. Launch angle to me looks a little bit riskier, I think, as the weather starts to heat up. And it is going to be the case today in Chicago, where it'll be at 78 degrees, it looks like, by first pitch. So a little bit of a jump there, but I still don't think that's enough to really spook me off of Rodon here. I feel like he's clearly the ace pitcher on the slate, clearly the best guy in terms of projections and all of that. I'd have a hard time moving away from Rodon, Greg, but the ownership, again, over 50% here, and there probably are diminishing odds of him being a top pitcher on the slate. But I think, to me, if you're playing half your lineups with Rodon, like, that's probably a good move to go to today.
Yeah, I still like Rodon a whole bunch. I usually, for an ace-type starting pitcher who has this much strikeout upside, it's somebody I'm generally going to get to really regardless of the ownership. Unless, it's like 90% ownership or something like that, then I would second think it. But for this slate, I mean, you look at the other pitching options, who else are we getting to, especially where we have to roster 2 pitchers on DraftKings. There's Rodon, there's Pineda, who I've already said I'm not exactly thrilled with. Canning's a fine option. Caprillion, he's a fine option for the Oakland A's. We actually don't have a starting pitcher yet for the Seattle Mariners, so that's something that could change. Dane Dunning, he's a fine option, but Rodon is so much better than all the other pitching options on the slate, and given how weak the other options are, I mean, it might legitimately only take 14 fantasy points from him or something like that for him to ultimately end up in the optimal lineup, because I don't know that he's going to get outscored by all these other guys, even if he only puts up like 14 or 15. So Rodon, the strikeouts have been ridiculous this year, 37.3% strikeout rate. He's also only walking 7.2% of hitters, which is nice, because something that we've seen as an issue with him earlier in his career, number one was injuries, but then number two, he had games where he was really erratic and struggled to throw strikes. Carlos Rodon this year has kind of been like the left-handed version of Corbin Burns, who was a young pitcher, came up with really good stuff, but struggled to command it and struggled to throw strikes. And now he's developed himself into an ace and a real Cy Young candidate. So Carlos Rodon, to me, is the top overall play on the slate.
So one question that I would have, and this is something that we had to, I think, deal with earlier in the week with Brandon Woodruff going against the Padres, where he's such an elite strikeout guy, but the team themselves doesn't strike out a lot, does bring some pretty good power. St. Louis has hit lefties really well in the year, just an 18% carry to 188 ISO, getting on base at a 351 clip. So these numbers all look really good, and some of the better marks on the slate as well. But at some point, I guess you sort of have to make the choice here which way you're going to go. And I would err on the side of believing in Rodon more, Greg, but I feel like we have to sort of address the fact that St. Louis has been shockingly good against lefties on the year. And does that give you any sort of reason to, I guess, mute Rodon ownership, or just, is that what keeps you, I guess, from getting him in really like every lineup?
No, I mean, he's the player who in the build I have, he's by far my most exposed player. So I don't really have any issue getting to him. And the other thing I said before also is, even if for him, he has a bad game, which he hasn't really had a lot of them this year. Let me check. What's the least amount of fantasy points he scored? He had one game against he had one outing against the Royals where he got hit around a little bit and only scored 8 fantasy points. But other than that, he has scored over 24 DraftKings points in every single start this year. So, I mean, the odds of him having a bad game just on the numbers we've seen this year, it doesn't really happen, right? Like, even his bad games has been, 24 fantasy points because of all that strikeout upside. He's striking out nearly, 40% of the hitters he faces. So even if he gives up a couple runs, which he generally hasn't done this year, he only has a 1.27 ERA. But let's say he goes out and gives up 3 or 4 runs, there's a pretty good chance he strikes out 8 or 9 hitters. And honestly, with the pitching options are so thin, it might not matter.
Yeah, I get it. I think certainly for cash games, he's going to be the safest play on the board. So if you are doing that for an early slate, feel free to dive in there. But let's talk about the St. Louis hitters, because they're going to be owned a little bit, especially the top 3. It looks like all these guys over 10% ownership, with Tommy Edman, Dylan Carlson, and Paul Goldschmidt. Nolan Arenado going to be less owned, even though he has been something of a lefty masher, though more so in his Colorado days, still hitting them pretty well and as a new home in St. Louis. But I do think the Cardinals, just getting on base a lot, then their potential here to break up a Rodon day. I don't know that they can make enough production for themselves. So I guess the park upgrade could be an asset, but I think I would stack some St. Louis today. I think, to me, it seems like worth just trying the luck here and hoping that you do see Rodon have one of those days that kind of bounces him down to a more, not middling pitcher, but a guy who's just not quite the world beater that he's been this year, where he does have that 37% K rate this year, but going back to 2019, closer to 32% K rate. So maybe there are some things here that could get a little bit worse for him. But I feel like St. Louis, it's sort of hard to have that level of faith, especially with some of the price tags here. Like Arenado's almost 6K. Tommy Edman's just shy of 5K. Like, it's a weird stack, Greg, and I'm just curious your thoughts on St. Louis, because it's a low implied total and it's a risky spot going against Rodon, but they've hit lefties so well. I feel like you have to give them a second look.
Yeah, the issue here is that just the ownership is kind of high, at least more than I would expect. The only player in this lineup who I'm overweight to the field in ownership on is Arenado. We have him project for 5% ownership. He's in 6% of my lineups right now. But other than that, I find it hard to come over the top of 11% Goldschmidt against Rodon. I find it hard to come over the top of 15% Dylan Carlson, 14% Tommy Edman. Like, these guys are picking up ownership in a way that you normally wouldn't expect against the guy who's clearly the top pitching option on the slate. So I would view them as a viable contrarian stack if their best hitters had no ownership. Like, if we had 2 or 3% on Paul Goldschmidt, if we had 2 or 3% on Tommy Edman, I would say, sure, go stack these guys up and be contrarian, get yourself a little leverage off of Carlos Rodon. But I don't really think that's the case to go there when we have these guys picking up, double-digit ownership already.
Yeah, no, I think that's reasonable too. And just the on-base numbers for St. Louis against lefties are just crazy. Like, Edman's a 358 on-base guy. Carlson's a 400 on-base guy. So's Goldschmidt, Arenado 390, Edmundo Sosa 380. Like, these are wild numbers again for guys getting on base. So I would just say, some marginal amount of concern for Rodon, just that like these guys drag the count out and make it so he can't get to the usual 6 innings per start that he's been throwing recently. But that's just me, talking about it on a 4-game slate where you can sort of poke holes in everything. I'm baffled by the on-base numbers these guys have against lefties. On the other side, we have John Gant. John Gant at 8,300 on DK. It's just a silly price tag for John Gant. He projects to be a 1x value today from Awesemo, so maybe not a guy who should be in the player pool. He has an 18% K rate, 1.6 whip, 5x FIP on the year, going against a White Sox team that has not hit righties particularly well for power this year, just a 140 ISO, but still a 107 WRC plus, still producing runs better than average. I don't see how you would play John Gant even on a slate of the size. I guess maybe positive regression is due his way, but like, he's still John Gant, Greg, and I don't get the play and I don't get the price tag.
Yeah, so I think negative regression is coming his way because he has a 2.04 ERA this year, and the underlying numbers suggest that shouldn't be the case. He had a 2.4 ERA last year, but this year it's a 2.04 ERA, a 5.07 expected ERA, a 5.02 xFIP, and the velocity numbers are crazy low for him considering what we've seen in the past. So the last 3 years, 2020, John Gant, or 2019, John Gant had a 96.1 average fastball velocity. 2020, John Gant, 94.5. This year, 91.4. So we're seeing a massive dip in how hard he's throwing. And it's not hard to see why, because he's starting now. Before he was pitching in a relief role and occasionally in long relief. But, it makes sense we'd see a dip in velocity in a starting role versus a relief role. But this is a really substantial drop off. And it just seems like he's probably better suited for the bullpen, given what some of his underlying numbers look like. And I understand that some people might just look at the 2.04 ERA and be like, hey, he's having success. But I don't really think that's an accurate representation of his talent level. He's been really, really lucky to only have a 3.6% home run to fly ball rate. Also, he is striking out so few hitters this year and walking a ton. So he has an 18.1% K rate and a 15.8% walk rate. So walking nearly as many guys as he's striking out. It seems like it's only a matter of time until John Gant just starts getting lit up. I think that he's somebody who's going to see his ERA start to tumble really quickly. And I think this is a really good spot to attack the White Sox. And also the field isn't really on them that heavily.
Yeah, that's fair. I think to me, the positive regression part's like he has been a 4.4 xFIP guy since 2019, and he's at a 5 this year. He's been a 21.7% K rate guy. He's at 18 this year, like which you mentioned. So I think to me, those are the numbers I think would positively regress. But the ERA numbers definitely would be a concern given that he has a 5 xFIP. Like that does mean that he's been playing a lot over his head. Either way, you're probably not playing John Gant. I think you'd sort of question whether he's going to continue to withhold production because he does keep the ball down pretty well, like extremely well. Only a 0.6% home run rate. I don't know. I feel like Gant to me wouldn't shock me if he continues to inhibit runs for the most part and get a little better in terms of strikeouts, but still 8,300. You're not playing this guy. He's 5,500. I think we can make this case a little more credibly. He's going against the White Sox. So Greg, 5.1 implied run total for them. They do have a kind of weaker lineup, I think, than usual up top. Nick Madrigal in the leadoff hole, Adam Eaton behind him. These guys are fine enough plays, but Madrigal, I feel like that one day he had his chalk is going to be driving his ISO for the rest of time, but it's still a 0.053 ISO since 2019 against righties, 0.075 ISO over the last season and change. Madrigal, I think the ownership is fine. The only ownership really that's going to be egregious here is Yohan Moncada over 15% on DK. And I still have no issues with the White Sox. I feel like going against John Gant, even for my concerns about him keeping the ball down and being a bit lucky in terms of that ERA, like the White Sox are in a good spot here against Gant overall. The price tags are very uncomfortable, but to me, if you are saving any value, whether it be at pitcher or hitting today, getting to a White Sox stack, to me, just a little bit underowned for what their potential should be here.
Yeah, I think the two priority teams to stack today are the White Sox, just based on overall what I expect of their production, and then the Orioles for leverage reasons and them just being really low owned. But I mean, look at the top stacks. So we have the White Sox project for a 16.2% chance to be the top stack of the day. That is the best odds. The second best odds go to the Minnesota Twins, but here's the ownership difference. We have the White Sox projected for an aggregate ownership of 13%, and the Twins project for 23.5%, even though we have the White Sox projected with a slightly better chance to be the top stack of the day. So I consider all of that, and I think the White Sox are a much better team to pay up for than the Twins. And then when you also consider that 16% chance of being a top stack of the day, the only player that has greater than 12% ownership is Yohan Moncada. So other than that, I mean, all these guys just seem woefully underowned. Jose Abreu should be picking up way more ownership. Adam Eaton, hitting towards the top of the lineup, he should have way more ownership. Nick Madrigal, I know you mentioned that he does have that one game that's an outlier that kind of changes stats a lot, but he's only 3,000 batting leadoff with 10% ownership. He's one of the better value plays on the slate. To me, he should be getting rostered a much higher clip than that, especially when we look at John Gant and all the regression, I think, in terms of run allowance that's going to be coming his way. So I think the White Sox are a very high priority team to stack.
It's also worth pointing out, too, this is a pretty big park downgrade for Gant, where he's going to one that does allow more power. Also is going to be warmer than you've seen earlier in parts of the year. So, I think there's a case to be made here to go to the White Sox heavy. Greg made it pretty well as well. Just the ownership not being that heavy on these guys, to me, is enough reason to get there. And the steep price tags, it could be a pay up to be contrarian spot, even for a short slate. Looks like we have not gotten a run of ownership yet. So let me just make sure that's still the case. If we get an update here, I'm going to pause money time for now so we can get to this when we get an update, because it's not going to be the most useful for you guys to talk about Luis Arias being the number 3 owned guy when he's not going to be that, because he's not playing today. But don't play Luis Arias if you were going to do that. That's one move to keep in mind. But hit that like button, guys. We appreciate that a bunch as well. And make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We have content going on all day long, from Josh's process videos all the way through to Live Before Locks for MLB, for NBA, for all the sports that we have going on right now. PGA content as well. There's so many things that you could be watching on this channel at any given time. So make sure you are subscribing. Go check out our packages as well at awesemo.com/join. Lots of options for you guys to get all the data that we talk about on here, the projections, the ownership projections, the top stacks tool, top pitchers tool, all of that. Get all of that in an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. And then you can also get a weekly pass just for MLB DFS if you want, with an Awesemo Plus MLB weekly package for just $15.95. So there are a lot of options on there. We also have our express packages that are under $5, but either way, stop guessing, start winning, join Awesemo Plus today. Let's talk about this next game. Seattle, 3.6 implied runs against James Kaprielian. And Kaprielian's actually been very good in a very limited sample size so far. 33% K rate for himself this year. Going back to last year, has faced slightly more batters, only 62 batters faced over the last couple seasons, but a 31% K rate since that period as well. Giving up a little bit in the way of power, but the swinging strike numbers also looking pretty good. Chase rate numbers looking solid enough. And going against Seattle, Cole Irvin, who I mentioned as a potential no-hitter guy just yesterday because he's bad and was facing Seattle, didn't quite pan out, but Kaprielian's actually got decent stuff, Greg, and he's pitching about 5 innings per appearance in his limited run so far this year. And I feel like going to him today, I would much rather do that than go to John Gant.
Yeah, and then I mean it's the 33.3% strikeout rate, so you're getting better chance of strikeout upside. I mean the only thing here that we have to say is, hey, this is a guy who spent most of his career in the minor leagues. There's probably a good reason he didn't get called up at any point. It's probably not because he was one of the best pitching prospects in baseball or anything like that. He's 27 years old. Career minor leaguer and just not ranked as a prospect. But yeah, good enough results so far. The pitching options are bad on the slate. He's cheap. He scored over 20 DraftKings points in each of his 2 starts in the big league so far this year. So with that in mind, relative to the other options we have, I think he's a pretty high priority pitching play. I know that right now we have him projected to score the second most fantasy points of any of the starting pitchers today. So it's pretty appealing when you look at Kaprielian compared to somebody like Michael Pineda and say, like, hey, we have Kaprielian at $1,500 less of a price tag, picking up about the same amount of ownership, but also projecting for slightly more fantasy points. So to me, he's actually the second overall best pitching play on the slate behind Rodon.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And the ownership is going to be there too. So I guess that's the next question to hit on, where Kaprielian currently projects for 34% ownership. That number could come up a little bit, maybe could drop a little bit in the run of ownership that we'll get here before lock. But Kaprielian at that ownership, Greg, like I agree with you. I think that he's the better play at that ownership than Pineda, but still, like, it does feel like it could be a little lofty going against Seattle, who's not great, but still does have some guys with enough pop to maybe make it tough on Kaprielian. He's given up a 12% barreled ball rate this year. Like, he is giving up a pretty good launch angle as well. So like, if they make contact, I think they can do some damage. The question is really whether they can make contact, given the fact that they're Seattle and Kaprielian's had good strikeout stuff. But does the ownership number seem right to you, Greg? Are you getting above that or beneath it? How are you handling it?
Yeah, above it. And the reason why is, so if I'm coming underweight to the field on Michael Pineda, and there's only so many pitching options at that point. I don't think John Gant's a good play. I don't think Jorge Lopez is a good play. Pineda's picking up a ton of ownership. I just have to go somewhere else. Griffin Canning is picking up over 50% projected ownership. So that's the number that I find it really hard to be overweight to the field on. Dane Dunning is somebody else that I think is worth being overweight to, but I really have a player pool of Rodon, Kaprelian, Canning, Dunning, and then some Pineda, but way underweight to the field on them. So there's only a handful of guys I'm really looking to roster, and I find it pretty easy to get overweight to the field on Kaprelian with the way my lineups are building.
Yeah, no, I got you. And I think that's certainly a reasonable take to have. And again, Kaprelian, high strikeout stuff, definitely a little more in the way of power than you like to see. And also in the way of fly ball, 69% fly ball rate. Not so nice when you're a pitcher. But, I think to me in this spot against Seattle, I think you have to have a good amount of Kaprelian today, especially on a short slate. Seattle hitters, though, like I think they are going to be, it looks like a little bit overowned on the top stack. So which surprises me somewhat. But I would agree that they do deserve some degree of ownership, especially that, Kaprelian is not an unknown commodity by any stretch, but a guy that still hasn't had the longest sample size of work. So certainly possible some of those power numbers continue to increase and the strikeouts drop a little bit. But Seattle's ownership, I feel like it's kind of ugly to go heavily to Seattle, knowing they have a low implied total and they're facing a guy who could easily strike out a lot of them today, given the fact they have a 26% K rate on the year against righties. So Greg, what are you getting out of Seattle hitters? Are you with the field? Are you under the field? How are you approaching them?
Yeah, pretty under the field, especially on the better hitters who are picking up a bunch of ownership. Like, I don't understand how we've got to a spot where the Seattle Mariners, who we've been picking on with pitchers all year, they've been no hit a couple of times. They've comparable ownership to the Chicago White Sox on this slate. That's really odd to me. So, I mean, we look at some of these hitters here: Haniger, double-digit ownership; Kelenic, double-digit ownership; Seager, Kyle Lewis, Ty France, Tommy Murphy. JP Crawford doesn't, but he's at 9.9% projected ownership. So really across the board, we're looking at a fairly popular team, and I don't really think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would agree. Like I would have thought there was some logic going to Kaprelian until seeing the ownership for these guys, where you have 6 of the first 7 top hitters here, all over 10% ownership. So the stack is pretty well represented. The only guys not getting owned are Jacob Nottingham and Donovan Walton, assuming that those guys get into the lineup at the bottom of the order. So it's going to be a pretty owned spot for Seattle. They have been bad. We've targeted them all year. It's tough. I kind of see the logic why people are getting there, but people are getting there too much. So it's one of those situations where you have to decide for yourself. Do you want to be with the field on a team that has been no hit multiple times this year? I think is a question for every person to identify for themselves today. Seattle starting pitcher expected to be Robert Duggar. I don't know if that's been confirmed everywhere, but that's what I was seeing this morning. We have the projections in for him as well. He's been a decent pitcher on the year as a borderline opener, I guess, pitching under 2 innings per appearance so far this year. Has a 3.1 xFIP, a 28% K rate, but going back to 2019, those numbers are a lot worse. 17% K rate, 5.8 xFIP. And Duggar, it seems like, whatever the limited sample size for him this year, Greg, like he's made some improvements, but he's not going to go deep enough into the game where even at 4K, like I could see getting a little bit if the price really works for the lineup construction that you want, where you're getting Rodon and maybe like the White Sox bats. But besides that, Duggar, I just don't feel any sort of confidence level to even suggest him to anybody out there to play.
No, he's thrown in his recent outings. He's thrown 22 pitches, 17 pitches. He did have one outing where he threw 49 pitches and went 3 innings in it, and then 23 and 26 pitches. So, I mean, this seems like in all likelihood a guy who at most is going 3 innings, which number one probably isn't enough to get you enough upside to win a tournament. And then number 2, I mean, if he gets hit around a little bit, he could ultimately only end up going, 1 inning or something like that. So I don't think this is a good spot to roster him, even if he has had a little bit of success this year, just because I doubt he's going to be in the game for very long.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think to me, that's why if the price tag at 4K, like he's the only guy who's priced there who's, has anything. I mean, he's the only guy who's priced there really is the main part, but especially for a guy at 4K who has gotten some strikeouts this year and shown some signs of improvement, I wouldn't mind playing him in a handful of lineups where, again, the construction really works for you. But I agree, like there's a reason he's going to be under 1% owned, and there's a lot of risk there that you just pitch 3 innings of very mediocre ball and get 1 strikeout for himself. And then that's probably not going to be enough to do it for you unless everything other part of your lineup goes off. The Oakland hitters projected for 4.9 implied runs on their side, Greg, and there was a lot of ownership going to these guys too. It's funny, like on a 4-game slate, like normally there's at least one spot where it's like, oh, this spot's a little underowned, and I guess that's really just the White Sox. But Oakland going to have a lot of ownership going to Matt Olson, a lot going to Seth Brown, a lot going to Mark Canha as well. Ramon Laureano at 6,200 is an egregious price tag. He will be less played, but still 6% ownership for him is a lot. Like I don't get this ownership at all. I know it's at a high implied total. Duggar's not that good. Seattle bullpen's actually not that bad though. 1.2 whip on the year. Oakland's a team where I'd rather flip this ownership to the White Sox by a pretty wide margin.
Yeah, it doesn't really make any sense. I don't even understand why is Laureano priced up that high. Here's his last handful of games. 7 fantasy points, 5, 0, 11, 31. All right, that's nice. 2 and 0. I mean, it's so odd to me now that all of a sudden, like Laureano of all players, we're just going to give a guy who has legitimately had 1 hit or 2 hits in his last 3 games. He's gone 2 for 13. He just gets priced all of a sudden to a salary that's like $2,000 more expensive than they normally see from him. So I don't really understand that at all. It's a very expensive price tag for him. And then the other guy's pretty expensive also. Kana, 5,500, Matt Olson, 5,000, Chapman, 5,000. So I think that the ownership on Oakland looks about appropriate, but they're so expensive that it's a team that I'm ultimately underweight to.
See, I think I'm wondering because DraftKings pricing has been weird recently, but I wonder if it's maybe them projecting Duggar to be the version of himself that's been in the league since 2019, where he's been really bad and thinking that somehow is going to lead to a lot of production or whatever his stint is, because like he has been bad since 2019 with a 17% K rate, giving up a 5.8 xFIP, 280 batting average. Like that has to be it, because these price tags, like playing in Oakland's park where it's still not temperature, still only 60 degrees by the time first pitch goes off. Like there's no other logical reason why this would be other than just thinking whoever Seattle's going to put out, whether it was Duggar or somebody else, that pitcher just must have been egregiously bad.
Yeah, so I think as of yesterday, they didn't have a starting pitcher named. Even this morning, I don't think they had officially named a starting pitcher, which is ultimately then they said, hey, it's a bullpen game, we're going with an opener. But maybe it's just a thing where the pricing algorithm just picked up either they thought it was going to be somebody really bad potentially starting, or maybe there's a thing where there just isn't a starting pitcher known. I haven't really tracked it that much, but maybe when there's not a starting pitcher known the day before when the pricing first goes up, they just default to overpricing everybody just in case it's some bad guy making a debut or something. But I tend to think it has something to do with the starting pitcher not being known yesterday.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Definitely weird price tags for Oakland, and one to me where, like the Laureano price tag is certainly the most egregious, but even 5K for Matt Olson, like I know he's hit home runs pretty well, but like, is he meaningfully better than some of the White Sox guys in the same price tag? Like, would you rather have him or Yerman Mercedes or Jose Abreu or Yohan Moncada or even for Minnesota guys? Like, I know we talked about them being chalky, but like, would you rather have Laureano or Nelson Cruz? I think I'd prefer to go to Nelson Cruz.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather have Matt Olson than Laureano at least also, and Laureano's $1,200 more expensive. It's hard to look at Laureano and find where the upside is when he is 1 homer in his last 8 games. It's a really odd price tag. Like Mike Trout is even usually 6,200.
Naman Mahajan saying, tell me players for Dream 11, which I believe is the foreign DFS site of note of, I don't even know what region, Greg, but hey, Greg, give me your top Dream 11 plays today if you can.
Well, let me Google Dream 11 first, because I have a feeling that is this even baseball related? Like,
I think they have all the sports, but it started as like, it's the Indian fantasy sports platform, but I think it started as just soccer, and then now they do everything, I believe.
How did you even know that?
I know useless things like that, I guess.
Why don't you know more useful things? Let's see.
Because I do shows with you, Greg. That's
that's a good enough reason. Let's see. Dream 11. So, I don't know. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, go roster Samir Panjari. He's on the front page here.
I do like the cricket guys being front and center. Like, that they're the stars of this one, and they're like, oh, these baseball guys, like these anonymous assholes. They're probably playing MLB like you were playing Korean baseball, where it's just like, oh, this guy looks like he's a person of note, and it said the cricket guys. That's the star players on Dream.
By the way, I just realized that I read off not even a cricket player's name. This is somebody who just plays DFS. I read off the name.
So roster him.
Yeah.
Today. For the most part, for anybody out there who is playing on some of these other niche sites that we're not talking about any length, and that includes, ones that are also of some note like Yahoo, like the fundamentals are still there. We still like a stack. Like we'll tell you guys like, hey, this pitcher's not good. The stack looks good, but the ownership sucks. So like if you're playing on a site where the ownership isn't egregious or the price tags make more sense, play those guys on whatever site you're playing on. So I'm very appreciative that we have people playing Dream 11 coming over here, or people playing Yahoo as well. But like, just kind of apply the knowledge as best you can to the other stuff. We're talking mostly about DraftKings and Fanduel pricing and ownership and all that, but it would be quite literally impossible for us to add more sites to the mix that we're trying to cover here. So, but kudos to the Dream 11 people out there. And Adam's the name saying cricket chalk. Yeah, the cricket chalk is the worst chalk. You got to fade that cricket chalk every time.
Yeah, and I'm trying to figure out, because the guy, apparently, I was just reading off, he won 20 locks the other day, which I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out what that converts to.
I don't even know that was a currency. I thought it was rupees. I thought it would have been rupees.
All right. Wait, well, why is this even? Yeah, so locks are Indian rupees, but if this is to be correct, the Google Translate here, they have some guy on the main here who won 20 locks. But I just did the conversion. That's 28 cents in US.
It is rupee time. It is lock time. Yeah, that's okay. Well, kudos to Dream 11 making it work out there. We got one question here we'll hit on. We're obviously spending a little time having fun because we got one more game to get to for you guys, and one that we don't have the lineups confirmed yet either, as Greg was talking about earlier in the show. Just try to plan around the idea that you're going to need to pay attention for the next couple hours to find out when these lineups are going to be out. But you want, I'm going to read the name. You want some of these nuts asking, do you prefer 5-3 stacks, or would you go more with a 4-3 stack with a one-off? Generally, I would say even for a slate of this size, I would still be pushing more towards the 5-man stacks and then be willing to get 5-2-1s or even 5-1-1-1s. But Greg, do you have any thoughts on that? Are you willing to go to a 4-3 on a shorter slate?
No, for DraftKings, it's always going to be, for me personally, 5-man stacks. 5-2-1 is the setup that I have most of my lineups usually end up being, but 5-3 also, you don't have to force it if it's not optimal for salary, but definitely 5-man stacks for me.
Yeah, the 5-man, the point of the 5-man, if you guys are new to MLB DFS or just not familiar with the logic for it, basically every at-bat that a guy has that is going to be successful creates another at-bat for the next guy. Same thing is true for that guy. So basically that's the reason why you stack, is because you're just getting more at-bats in. Also having guys on base increases the likelihood of the next guy having better results for his at-bat. So that's sort of the reason why you do go to the 5-man, because a lot of times if you go to 4-3s on sites where you are allowed to go to 5, you're going to find a 5-man stack is going to beat you more often than not, because there's just sort of the trickle-down effect that makes it better. So that's the logic for it. That's why we talk about it a lot. And we try to not beat that into the ground too much here, but generally for the most part, for just to be optimal most days, you're going to the 5-mans and then the 4-mans on FanDuel, and then your 11-mans on Dream 11, I presume. Stack up every player on the roster and the pitcher. Next game, or last game on the slate, Texas 4.3 implied runs against another chalk pitcher we haven't even gotten to yet, going against Griffin Canning. And Griffin Canning has been hit fairly hard, also giving up some walks this year. 261 batting average allowed so far this year, 1.5 whip. 4.2 xFIP is actually an improvement, so I guess maybe you could see some things turning around from here. K rate's pretty much in line with where he's been historically, a 25.3% K rate compared to a 24.6% K rate going back to 2019. The power, though, I feel like that should stabilize a little bit, but it is a warmish day expected today in Anaheim, just shy of 80 degrees. So Griffin Canning, as Griffin Canning chalk, I'd rather get Kaprelian. I think I don't want to be with the field on Griffin Canning, Greg, but how are you feeling about old Griff?
Yeah. So to me, just because the options are so thin, I can't advocate for fading him entirely because it's not what I did, but I think it makes sense to flip the ownership numbers on Kaprelian and Canning and be overweight to the field on Kaprelian, be underweight to the field on Canning. I think over 50% ownership for Canning is just a little bit too rich. He is a prospect who came in pretty well regarded when he first came into the big leagues, and he pitched well in his first season, except he also had an elbow injury and has been apparently pitching through a partial UCL tear for the last couple of years. And, he's been getting okay, but not great results. He has a mediocre strikeout rate. It's an okay matchup against the Rangers. It's just a little bit too much ownership going to him. So have him in your player pool, but I wouldn't have him in over half your lineups like the field does.
It's actually kind of surprising to see his swinging strike rate and chase rate. He's over a 15% swinging strike rate this year and a 33% chase rate. Both numbers up about 2% each from where he was since 2019. Going against Texas, who does strike out at a 26% clip. Like, I don't want to be on 50% Griffin Canning. I think I would still get some, though, just looking at these a little more, because Alex has talked about in some of the deeper dive shows that swing, strike rate, and chase rate could be more predictive than some of the other pitching stats, because you're seeing more pitches per at bat. You're seeing an average of 4 pitches per at bat. So you can see a little bit more than what the actual at bats are worth. And Canning might end up being a better strikeout guy over the course of time. Like, it's not crazy to me that he could be unlucky. He's also got a 310 BABIP that's up, not significantly, but compared to a 290 BABIP. I see the logic in Canning a little bit more than when I was first saying. So that's really me just kind of walking it back. Still think 50% is egregious, but like if you had a third of him, like we had some of the other guys, like I think that's fine.
Yeah, I would still. I mean, he's my 4th most roster starting pitcher right now. To me, the overall priorities, it's Rodon 1, it's Kaprelian 2, Dane Dunning 3, Canning 4, and then Michael Pineda 5. So relative to his field ownership, he's somebody to come underweight to the field on, which I would think it's kind of weird with 4-game baseball slates, because if you're playing a bunch of lineups, it's hard to, outright say like I'm playing 0% of anybody. So it's everything always in reference to what the field ownership is. So in terms of how he's owned, my preference would be that Griffin Canning doesn't have a good game, even if he's in 30% of my lineups.
Yep. No, I got you. I think that makes sense too. And it's a helpful way to look at baseball, where it's certainly less binary than a lot of other sports. And playoff NBA, I think at this point, you guys know as well, if you're doing that, not very binary either. You're playing a lot of guys. Even if you're coming under the field, you're probably still going to have some amount. But baseball in particular, it's so much about just kind of planting your flags in different positions and hoping they work out. And I think just getting less Griffin Canning today, even if he does end up being more of the good version of himself than the bad version over the course of time, it's going to be a better move to play a little bit less in the field if he's going to be over 50% owned. On the other side, we have Texas, 4.3 implied runs, a lot of ownership going to Willie Calhoun for some reason, a lot going to Joey Gallo as well. I guess the lefty split. Actually, no, lefty splits for Griffin Canning, not that bad either. He is worse against righties overall. So I don't necessarily get that one, but Texas, another team where they're going to be appropriately owned, it looks like, as a leverage play against a highly owned pitcher. And as a result, like if you're with the field on Texas, I don't hate it, Greg, but you're really not getting anything sneaky here by going against Griffin Canning.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is there's some really wonky ownership on this slate. Like you mentioned before, like why is Willie Calhoun picking up that much ownership? The one that makes the most sense to me of any of these plays, and I know it's somebody you've talked about a couple of shows we've done too, is Adolis Garcia has been ridiculous this year. He's hitting the ball so well, and it's odd to me that he would be picking up 13% ownership where Willie Calhoun's at 25% ownership, because Garcia has been a much better hitter this year. So Garcia is the individual hitter where I think it makes the most sense to come overweight to the field on in terms of ownership. And it's not like he's slowed down either. He's 4 home runs in his last 4 games. He's been consistently good the entire season. He's probably, as of now, if the season was going to end, he'd be running away with the American League Rookie of the Year award. So Adolis Garcia is the individual one-off Texas Rangers hitter that makes the most sense.
Adolis Garcia, an 8% home run rate so far, 100 at-bats he's up to now, going against right-hand pitching, and he's been a monster. Some could say he reminds them of a young version of myself and MLB The Show, with his pure power and just really driving it out no matter what park he's in. And I would say for Adolis Garcia, I agree. He's $600 cheaper than Willie Calhoun, and I get people do like the cheap leadoff guy, but like Calhoun's fine, but he's clearly not a power guy like Adolis Garcia is, and I think that's something noteworthy to know. And also, it's not like Calhoun steals bases either, so Adolis Garcia is just the better play, I think, in every possible way. Anybody else for Texas jump out meaningfully for you? I feel like Kiner Falefa at low ownership, if you're playing Texas, putting Kiner Falefa in, not a player that I would find to be a priority normally, but that's one way to play Texas and get that ownership down a little bit. Same thing for Brock Holt and Jose Trevino, but neither guy that good other than Trevino being a catcher. Does anybody else in Texas jump out for you, Greg, that you would get to maybe try to drop that ownership for Texas down?
Not really. It's just the only player that stands out to me is I think Adolis Garcia is going under-owned. The other guys all seems about appropriate to me. I think one other guy that you could reason yourself into going overweight to the field in is Nate Lowe at 10.5% ownership. I think that's a number that's fine to come overweight to the field on. I'm overweight to it. So the only 2 hitters here that I'm really getting to more of than the field in a way that matters is Adolis Garcia and Nate Lowe.
Yep, that seems reasonable. And if you want to come under on some guys, again, Calhoun, very obvious play in the leadoff spot and a cheap play as well, but coming in under on him and Joey Gallo might be good moves if you are trying to play Texas, even though they do have that lofty ownership. Dane Dunning on the other side. Dane Dunning has also been fairly good this year. Numbers actually kind of leveling out in a way that he doesn't look as good as he did in earlier parts of the year, but still has faced 184 batters so far this season, a 1.3 whip for himself, up to a 26% carry, which is a slight improvement from where he was going back to last season at a 25.5 35% clip. Swing strike rate, chase rate, nothing to worry about there. Dunning, I think, looks like a fine play normally. On this slate, though, going against an Angels team that strikes at, on the year, 24.6% clip, so slightly above league average against righties. I don't think this is going to be an easy one for Dane Dunning, though. And this kind of spot is one to me that I do think you're going to see the Angels kind of chip away at the good production he's had for himself so far this year on the most part. A 1.1% on run rate in particular, like that's going to come up, I think, in this spot for the Angels with the 4.7 implied run total. I think it does come up. So Dunning, 20% owned today. If you were there, I wouldn't hate it. If you were at 10%, I feel like that also wouldn't be the worst move.
Yeah, I'm slightly overweight to him right now, and it's really just a product of not liking some of the other pitchers on the slate. Like I think if I think Pineda's overowned, if I think that Griffin Canning's overowned, at a certain point, there's somebody who I have to be overweight to the field on, and Griffin Canning is one of those guys. I mean, Dane Dunning is one of those guys for me. So with Dunning, I think a couple of things that are nice about him. Number one is, let's say the Rangers go out and win this game. You're getting a little bit of leverage there because Griffin Canning is the most rostered pitcher on the slate. He is over 50% projected ownership. If he pitches poorly, one of the things that happens, Dane Dunning's in line for a win. So I like the little bit of leverage you get there. And then also he is a guy who decent enough strikeout numbers this year, 26.1% K rate. If you look at his numbers for his career, pretty solid, 3.84 ERA, 3.15 FIP, and has always been a guy that's just a little bit too cheap for fantasy purposes. Even if it is a tough matchup, I don't think he warrants being priced under 7,000 because he's a guy who's always delivered fairly decent fantasy results.
Yeah, I get that. And I think, Dunning, just overall, a guy that has really done a good job of run prevention over the course of his career, 3.6 xFIP since 2019, 3.1 xFIP this year. So maybe there are some pathways for him to be useful today. I just think the matchup's going to be tougher than some of the ones that he's had so far this season. And to me, just trying to pinpoint those matchups that lead a guy to be closer back to his longer term sample size is a spot that I don't mind going to. And I think Dunning, 20% though, he's not that egregious on this slate. Angels hitters though, some guys a little more egregious. Show Ohtani going to be over 20%, Anthony Rendon over 20%. You have a low-owned Jose Iglesias, low-owned Jared Walsh. I think to me, Greg, going to the full stack would just be the more appealing move because I think if you're not going to have Ohtani and Rendon in the mix for yourself, or if you are going to have them in the mix, you want to get that ownership down and I think try to get the whole lineup in. And I think going to Walsh, going to Iglesias up top is a fine move as well. Justin Upton, I'm never the biggest fan of, but he's perfectly fine. Kurt Suzuki, I probably like more than I should as well, but he's a catcher who would be stacked up with these guys. And at 2,800 on DK, I don't mind that flyer. But the Angels, to me, I think just an appealing, large stack. I would rather get to the 5-man than the 3-mans because of that high ownership for Ohtani and Rendon. But how are you feeling about the Angels, Greg? Are you willing to be with a chalky Ohtani? I know you have historically been a fan.
Yeah, I think that in terms of the hitters we have on this slate, there aren't very many good ones, and especially because some of the offenses I like earlier in the show, I said Baltimore is a fairly high priority for me, and they're very cheap. So I'm finding I have a lot of space to pay up for one-off hitters in my lineups, and that's getting me a little bit overweight to the field on Ohtani. Rendon isn't even that egregiously expensive at 4,600, and he's still a really good hitter. So I think that's a number I'm fine getting over the 21% on. So this is a team that overall, I think as a stack, it's about appropriately owned. It's a team to be neutral on. But as a one-off, I think Ohtani is a pretty high priority today.
And if you have a construction that really works, I do think just swapping from Ohtani to Jared Walsh wouldn't be the craziest thing in the world for more than, actually, I guess less than half the ownership for Jared Walsh at comparable price tags. Ohtani is the better hitter, but actually, Walsh has been hitting righties pretty well overall too. 295 ISO for him, 153 WRC plus compared to 128 for Ohtani. So I think that's one way where if you wanted to play Angels in a short stack and get different, I think just taking one of Walsh, I guess over Ohtani or Rendon might be the move to do that. Any last thoughts? You want to do a home run pick before we close it out here? We didn't get that run of ownership, so I'm not sure what's going on with that guy. So unfortunately, I'll give you guys some of the plays that we know will be in lineups. Griffin Canning, 53% on DraftKings. Carlos Rodon, 52% on DraftKings. Pineda, 35%. We talked about him earlier. And James Kaprielian. It's all chalk pitching today on FanDuel, on DraftKings rather. On FanDuel, we don't have the ownership for them because it's a weird short slate, so that's something to keep in mind for that as well. But make sure to watch out for the lineups and all of that because there are going to be some players who might get ruled out that we talked about. Some players who will be ruled in that we can't hit on because we just don't know the lineups for the 2 late games yet. Greg, give me a home run pick and any plugs for yourself as well.
Well, first of all, shout out to Thomas Tyner in the chat, and I think in honor of what he said, it's the lock of the day, but spelled LAKH in honor of the rupees. But I'm going to go Shohei Ohtani as my home run pick of the day. Definitely not a creative one, except I think it's the right choice for this particular slate. So give me Ohtani, who is among the leaders for home runs.
And I will take, I'll go to one of the Seattle guys against Kaprelian, I guess, and I'll take Kyle Seager against Kaprelian. He has had a little more of a hurdles for himself going against lefty hitters, and I do think that the pitching as an option for Kaprelian, he's still one of the better options on the slate. But I think he gives up one bomb today, and hopefully it does go to old Kyle Seager. Go follow at Ehrenberg DFS, follow at Chris Spags, follow at Awesemo_com, and make sure you are liking this video as well as subscribing to the channel because we're gonna have content coming up all day, including in 2 hours. I will be back once more to talk about the main slate, doing a deeper dive today with Alex and Max. So come join us then. We appreciate you guys for being here. Watch out for those lineups. Make sure you are updating everything for the 2 late games and make sure to just pay attention. We'll see you guys again soon. Enjoy your days. Good luck.